Did the Roman Empire really have to fall? This is a notion that I have now heard quite a few times, but is it really the case? Was the fall of the Roman Empire an inevitable fact, or could it have been prevented? Well, friends of late Roman history, let us try to answer that question. Throughout human history, there were countless empires, but even though they were very different, they all had one thing in common. They all fell. Every man-made empire, it appears, falls sooner or later, and it undergoes different stages. These can be defined differently. Sir John Glubb, for example, defines the life cycle of an empire in 8 distinct stages. 1. The age of pioneers. 2. The age of conquests. 3. The age of commerce. 4. The age of affluence. 5. The age of intellect. 6. The age of decadence. 7. The age of decline. And 8. The age of collapse. David Murrin has another definition in which an empire undergoes 5 stages. 1. Regionalization. 2. Ascension to empire. 3. Maturity. 4. Overextension. And 5. Decline and legacy. He has created a chart showing the whole 2,200-year history of the Roman Empire from the founding of the city of Rome to the fall of Constantinople. In the case of Rome, the period from 700 BC to 200 BC can be seen as regionalization, in which Rome rose from a local power around Latium to the power that would dominate the Western Mediterranean after the Second Punic War. From 200 BC to 45 AD then, we had the ascension to empire, where the martial spirit was still strong and the Roman legions continued conquering the whole Mediterranean, but also far away regions such as Britain or parts of Mesopotamia. This inevitably led to overextension, so that external enemies had an increased chance in overrunning parts of the empire. And lastly, we have decline and legacy. Although these are simplified models, they do explain the driving mechanisms behind the rise and fall of empires. So this means that the Roman Empire invariably had to fall. Well, yes, since every empire has by definition a finite lifetime, the Roman Empire would have under any circumstance collapsed sooner or later. However, I will make the case that the fall of the Roman Empire could have actually been in our future. We saw that the entire length of Roman history, from its earliest stages when Rome was founded until the fall of the last Eastern Roman strongholds, spans a bit over 2,200 years. That is really an incredibly long time. If we try to visualize this time span, it might surprise us that we actually live much nearer to the fall of Constantinople than the people during the fall of Constantinople lived to the reign of Justinian. The reign of Justinian was for them 900 years in the past. The reign of Augustus almost 1,500 years, 3 times longer than from our time to the fall of Constantinople. Such are the incredible time frames of ancient Rome. Thus, is it really so hard to imagine that the Roman Empire could have survived a few hundred more years? Just 26% more, so that it would still exist in our time. I completely agree with the notion that every human-made empire will fall sooner or later, but who is to say that the Roman Empire could not have survived in some form until today? There are actually examples of states that existed uninterrupted longer than the Roman Empire's 2,206 years. Japan, for example, has been ethnically homogeneous and has not been conquered since about 2,680 years. Old Vietnam for 2,621 years from 2879 to 258 BC, and Ethiopia for 2,916 years from 980 BC to 1936 AD. So technically, we see that it would be possible for an empire or kingdom to survive for hundreds of years longer than the Roman Empire. And please like this video and subscribe so that you won't miss any future videos on the fascinating era of the late Roman Empire. There is a strong anti-correlation on YouTube between intellectual complexity and monetary revenue, as you can imagine, but I really don't want to make YouTube videos with the purpose of monetary gain, else I would have chosen a different topic. So Maiorianus really is a complete 100% passion project of mine. Therefore, please consider supporting this work on Patreon or via YouTube membership, because I really want this channel to be long-term sustainable. I really want to still make videos in 5 or 10 years, since I have already amassed 250 plus future video topics only on the late Roman Empire, and the list is still growing. I want to thank each and every one of you who is supporting this channel. I really hope Maiorian would be proud. Gratias tibiago amici. So then, could the Roman Empire really have survived until today? I often hear arguments that the Roman Empire had to fall because it had so many fundamental systemic problems. That is of course true, it really had systemic problems. For example, the Romans were never able to solve the succession problem. After the fall of the Republic, there were countless civil wars over who would be next emperor. Throughout Roman history, the first time after the death of Nero until the later stages of the Eastern Roman Empire, there were always civil wars against usurpers. Rome never managed to establish an ordered succession system, and this of course severely weakened the empire. Because if you have external enemies threatening you, you want to fully focus on fighting them and not waste your resources and manpower on internal struggles. During the crisis of the 3rd century, an incredible number of emperors and counter-emperors and usurpers were fighting against each other. Basically, from 230 to 280 AD, there was constant civil war, which cost the lives of many Romans. During that time, the empire actually almost fell. The empire split into 3 parts. There were incredible pandemics that severely decimated the Roman population and thus reduced the size of the army, and there were barbarian invasions from all sides. The Goths ravaged the Balkans, the Alemanni northern Italy and Gaul, and Persia was threatening the east. It looked really bad. In an alternate timeline, the Roman Empire did end then and there. But why did it survive 1200 years longer? Because through some sheer luck, there were the right people present at the right time who displayed an incredible amount of valor and skill and saved the empire from the brink of destruction. One such person is of course the legendary Aurelian. If he would not have existed, but instead we would have had a Honorius type of person, it could very well be that the Roman Empire would have fallen then and there. But Aurelian defeated the split-away empires, reincorporated them into the Roman Empire, and defeated the Goths, the Vandals, the Teutongi, the Sarmatians, and the Carpi, thus securing the borders of the empire. Or Probus, who defeated the Alemanni, the Franks, and the Burgundians, the same tribes who would 130 years later successfully invade the Western Roman Empire. The survival of the Roman Empire sometimes really did depend on the actions of one single person. This was the fundamental weakness or the strength of the empire. The system of emperor would be excellent when you had a capable emperor, but really bad when you had a weak one. And make no mistake, the Roman Empire already faced the same problems during the crisis of the 3rd century as it did 200 years later. A very large and expensive to maintain army, therefore forcing the emperors to debase the currency, therefore creating huge economic problems, or a very high gap between rich and poor, or the unfair system of slavery, or a very high degree of specialization which made the provinces vulnerable to barbarian raids, or a society that became more and more unwilling to fight for the empire, or the unfair and brutal practice of gladiatorial games, or declining agricultural revenue, or a collapsing trade network, or declining population in many cities, or rampaging corruption. All these problems that are often cited as the big problems of the 5th century were already present during the crisis of the 3rd century. And yet, the empire would survive for 1200 more years. So therefore, I cannot accept that the Roman Empire had to fall due to the systemic problems. And I want to present my own thesis, namely that despite being a flawed system, the Roman Empire was able to survive for so long because first, the Romans were incredibly adaptable and capable of change. And second, somehow, there always seemed during times of crisis to emerge just the right person at the right time who would save the day. Aurelian and Probus saved the empire in the 3rd century. Julian saved the Western Empire from invasions in the 350s. And Stilicho saved the empire until 406 from the Germanic invaders like Alaric and Radagaisus. But then in the 5th century, the tide of luck turned against the Romans. It is my strong belief that had Stilicho not been killed, the Western Empire might have survived. Rome was only sacked because his treaty with Alaric became null and void with his death, and it was him who won major victories against the Germanic invaders time and time again. Now sure, under his watch, Gaul and Hispania were overrun by Germanic invaders after 407, but the poor guy didn't even get a real chance of dealing with the problem because he managed to defeat Radagaisus only as late as 406, and Honorius already had him killed in 408. Who knows what Stilicho might have achieved had he lived? He might have been able to pacify the Visigoths, and with Alaric's help and his Visigoths as Federate soldiers, he might have then fought against the Germanic invaders in 408 and later years. Maybe he would have even decisively defeated the Vandals, the Burgundians and the Suevi. In such an alternate timeline, the Visigoths, not having sacked Rome, would not have established a kingdom in Aquitania. Stilicho might have chosen to unite forces with Constantine III instead of stupidly wasting the forces of the empire by fighting usurper after usurper, such as happened in our timeline. A capable man at the right time might have averted the fall of the Western Empire, such as happened in our timeline with Aurelian, Probus and Julian. Or even as late as 460, even then the Western Empire almost recovered due to Maiorianus' legendary reconquests. Had he managed to reconquer Africa, the Western Roman Empire would probably have survived. Sometimes it really came down to luck or no luck. In this case, Maiorian had no luck, and his fleet for the reconquest of Africa was burned by traitors. This singular event changed the course of the entire history. Had this not happened, he would have reconquered Africa. Later on, he would have had enough revenue from this rich province not to disband his army, and Ricimer would have stood no chance. His reforms might have taken hold, and the Western Roman Empire might have really survived. Or even as late as 468 in the final try to restore the Western Roman Empire under the Western Roman Emperor Anthemius and the Eastern Roman Emperor Leo I. A giant fleet was sent to Africa consisting of 1,100 ships in order to defeat the Vandals and reconquer the province for the empire. And the operation would have almost succeeded had Basiliscus, the commander of the fleet, not made a fatal error of judgment. It again came down to the decision of one man. One decision that would change the course of the entire history. I talked about it in great detail in this video here. Had he made the right decision, even then the Western Roman Empire might have been restored to some extent. And if the Western Roman Empire would have survived, it is very likely that the Eastern Roman Empire would have also survived far longer. With the help of the Western Roman Empire, the East might have had a fighting chance against the Arab invasions. The Eastern Roman Empire only lost many provinces to the Arabs because of the preceding extremely devastating Persian War of 602 to 630. And because the Slavs and Avars were overrunning the Balkans at the same time. The East really had to fight a multi-front war against many different enemies on its own. But had the Western Roman Empire still existed in those days, the West could have dealt with the Slav and Avar invasions, while the East could have fully concentrated on the Persians and Arabs. The West might even have sent reinforcements to hold off the Arab invasions, or in order to reconquer Egypt and the Levant. As soon as the Western Empire had fallen in our timeline, it is my belief that the fate of the East was also sealed. The West could not survive without the East, and the East also could not survive without the West. Europe, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, never cared too much for the Eastern Romans, because they were seen as the Greeks, and the schism of Christianity further decreased the sympathy for the Eastern Romans. But had the Western Roman Empire survived, had Stilicho not been killed, or had Majorian recaptured Africa, or had Basiliscus not made the wrong decision, the Western Empire might have survived, and the Roman Empire might really have survived until our modern times. How the world would look if that would have happened is really interesting to think about, and we shall explore that in another video, because that of course strongly depends on the point of divergence, so when the timelines started to deviate. But one thing is certain, the world would be a very different place. And if you are interested in learning when the end for the Western Empire began, you can watch this video here in the upper right corner. But if you are more interested in learning about why the Eastern Roman Empire survived for so long, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias tibiago and bene valete.